Morning at a private Arizona airport. A sleek business jet prepares for its critical post-maintenance test flight. Elite engineers swarm the aircraft, checking every bolt. In the background stands Daniel Brooks, a 41-year-old contract technician. He's not part of the primary team. Elena Whitmore, the 27-year-old CEO, is losing her patience. The flight is hours behind schedule. When Daniel whispers, "This shouldn't take off yet," the room goes cold. A manager snaps, "We've checked everything." Elena glares at Daniel. "Fly it, or get off the project." Daniel doesn't blink. He speaks 6 words. "You don't want this airborne like this. Watch. Believe." Daniel Brooks was a man who lived in the narrow, pressurized gaps of the aviation world. At 41, his face was a map of high-altitude discipline and the quiet, enduring weariness of a man who worked 2 lives, one to keep the world's elite in the air and one to keep a small home safe on the ground. He was currently a freelance maintenance technician, a ghost engineer who stepped into hangars for short-term contracts to stabilize aging fleets or troubleshoot the newest prototypes. He didn't have a permanent office with a view of the runway. He didn't have a corporate ID that granted him access to the executive gym. He was the man in the simple blue-collar jumpsuit who sat at a folding table in the corner of the IT lab, surrounded by cables and cold coffee. Daniel chose this life by design. He was a single father to 9-year-old Emma. 5 years ago, his world had been surgically hollowed out when his wife, Sarah, passed away. Since that day, Daniel had systematically dismantled his old high-pressure career at a major aerospace defense firm. He had been a lead systems architect, a man who designed the very flight control logic that modern jets relied on. But the 70-hour weeks and the international red-eye flights to London and Singapore were a luxury his heart could no longer afford. He needed a life with a hard stop, a life that allowed him to be at the school gate at 3 p.m. and on the sofa for bedtime stories at 8 p.m. He traded the prestige of a VP title for the flexibility of a contractor, because his daughter's laughter was the only currency he cared about. His resume, if anyone bothered to read it, was a masterpiece of technical achievement. He understood the logic of flow better than most CEOs understood their own stock prices. He could hear a microscopic hairline fracture in a fuel pump just by the way the vibration resonated through the airframe. But to the executives at Whitmore Aero, Daniel was essentially invisible. He was a line item in the temporary staffing budget. They saw a man who arrived in a 10-year-old pickup truck, a man whose hands were perpetually stained with hydraulic fluid, and they assumed he lacked ambition. In their world, if you weren't constantly climbing the ladder, you were standing still. Daniel didn't mind the invisibility. It was his camouflage. He took pride in the honesty of the metal. Unlike people, machines didn't lie to get a promotion. They didn't manipulate data to please a board of directors. A machine was either true or it was failing, and Daniel's job was to be the witness to that truth. He moved through the hangar like a ghost, fixing what was broken and staying out of the shouting matches that defined the executive floor. On this particular morning, the hangar was a pressure cooker. The Vanguard G-X, the company's most ambitious project, was sitting on the tarmac, ready for a high-stakes test flight. The jet was meant to be the fastest and most efficient in its category, but the development had been plagued by unexplainable delays. Elena Whitmore, the CEO, was under immense pressure. She was a phenom who had inherited the firm at 25 and turned it into a billion-dollar beast. She was brilliant, decisive, and notoriously relentless. She viewed her company as a perfect machine, and she had no patience for friction. Daniel had been called in to assist with the final fuel cell calibration. He was standing near the port wing, monitoring the secondary systems on a handheld tablet. He wasn't part of the inner circle of engineers who were crowded around Elena. But as the engines whined to life for the pre-flight taxi, Daniel felt it. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a warning light. It was a shiver, a subtle, high-frequency stutter in the feedback loop of the secondary flight surfaces. It was a phantom in the code that shouldn't be there. He watched the elite team of engineers check their digital dashboards. They were nodding. They were reporting nominal. They were looking at the data they expected to see, while Daniel was listening to the data the aircraft was actually screaming. He saw the timeline on the wall. They were already 12 minutes late for the flight window. He saw Elena's face, a mask of cold determination. He knew that speaking up would make him a target. He knew that in a room full of Ivy League degrees, the voice of a temporary technician was an unwelcome noise. But he also thought about the pilot in the cockpit. He thought about the laws of physics that don't care about quarterly dividends. He took a slow, grounding breath and stepped forward. In a real work environment, the most valuable intelligence often sits in the lowest position. We are trained to respect titles, but the metal doesn't care about your rank. Sometimes the person who says the least is the only one who truly knows why the system is failing. Being ordinary is often the best way to see the extraordinary truth. The sun was beating down on the Arizona tarmac, turning the hangar's concrete floor into a radiating mirror. Elena Whitmore stood at the base of the boarding stairs, her fingers tapping a rhythmic, impatient beat on the handle of her briefcase. Her phone was buzzing incessantly. Investors from New York, partners from London, all demanding a success report by noon. Every minute the G-X sat on the ground was a minute the market was losing faith in her leadership. "Tell me we're rolling, Marcus," Elena said, her voice sharp as a blade. Marcus, the lead project engineer, adjusted his glasses, his face flushed from the heat. "Checklist is 99% complete, ma'am. The software is reporting a perfect sync. The pilots are just waiting for the final clearance from the tower. We're going to hit the Mach window perfectly." It was then that Daniel's quiet voice cut through the professional chatter. "This shouldn't take off yet." The silence that followed was jarring. It was the kind of silence that happens when a glass breaks at a formal dinner. Elena turned slowly, her eyes narrowing as she found the source of the interruption. She saw the man in the blue uniform. She saw the grease on his knuckles and the calm, steady look in his hazel eyes. She didn't see an engineer. She saw a delay. "Who are you?" Elena asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Brooks, Daniel Brooks," he replied, not flinching. "I'm on the contract maintenance team. I've been monitoring the secondary loop response during the engine cycle. The feedback is inconsistent." Marcus let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Inconsistent? Daniel, the sensors are all in the green. We've run the neural net diagnostics 3 times this morning. There isn't a single error code in the log. You're talking about a feeling, while I'm looking at $5 million worth of data." "I'm talking about a latency error," Daniel countered, his voice gaining a resonant, authoritative strength. "The software is smoothing out the data to make it look clean on your screens, but the physical actuators are lagging by 0.4 milliseconds. At sea level, it's nothing. But when the pilot hits the high-speed transition at 30,000 feet, that lag will turn into an oscillation. The plane will start fighting its own pilot. It's not a software bug, Elena. It's a physical feedback conflict." Elena stepped closer to him, effectively breaking the circle of her elite team. She looked at Daniel's scuffed boots and then back at the sleek, multi-million-dollar jet. She was a woman of logic, and right now, the logic was being pulled in 2 directions. On one side was her entire leadership team and the digital data. On the other side was a man she had never spoken to before today. "You're telling me my engineers are wrong because of 0.4 milliseconds?" Elena asked. "I'm telling you the aircraft is telling the truth, and the computer is telling you what you want to hear," Daniel said. The pressure on Elena was suffocating. If she stopped the flight now, the board would question her decisiveness. The cost of a grounded day was astronomical. She looked at the pilots in the cockpit, young men who were eager to make history. She saw the ambition in their eyes. She realized that she had been building a company on the appearance of success for so long that she had forgotten how to handle a genuine warning. Her frustration, fueled by the heat and the investors, finally boiled over. "I don't have time for guesses, Daniel," Elena snapped. "You're a contract technician. Your job is to follow the checklist, not to rewrite the aeronautics. If you're so certain this jet is a death trap, then walk away. In fact, fly it or get off the project. If you aren't willing to clear it for takeoff, then your contract is terminated effective immediately. We need people who believe in this machine, not people who look for reasons to fail." The hangar went deathly quiet. A few engineers looked at their shoes, embarrassed by the raw weight of the threat. Daniel stood his ground. He thought about Emma. He thought about the promise he had made to always be home for dinner. He knew that walking away would be the safe choice, but he also knew that if he walked away, he was leaving those pilots to face a ghost he had already identified. "I'm not looking for a reason to fail, Elena," Daniel said, his voice dropping into a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air. "I'm looking for the reason we survive. You don't want this airborne. Like this. If you force this takeoff, you aren't being decisive. You're being reckless with a miracle." Elena stared at him. She expected him to beg. She expected him to apologize and go back to his cart. But Daniel didn't move. He stood like a statue of integrity against the desert sun. He wasn't ordinary, and for the first time that morning, Elena Whitmore started to wonder if she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. True pressure doesn't come from a deadline. It comes from the conflict between what we know is right and what we are being told to do. In a crisis, people usually choose the fastest path, not the safest one. It takes an incredible amount of courage to be the one who says, "Wait," when everyone else is running toward a cliff. Experience is a whisper that you have to be quiet enough to hear. The silence in the hangar was no longer awkward. It was tactical. Elena Whitmore stood in the center of the bay, caught between her own ego and the chilling certainty in Daniel's voice. She looked at Marcus, her lead engineer. "Marcus," Elena said, her voice clinical, "rerun the elevator sync test. I want the raw telemetry, not the process dashboard. I want to see the millisecond layer." Marcus scoffed, but he didn't argue this time. The weight of the moment had shifted. He sat down at the main terminal, his fingers flying across the keys with a frantic energy. For 5 minutes, the only sound in the hangar was the rhythmic clicking of the mechanical switches and the hum of the aircraft's cooling fans. Daniel stood a few feet back, his arms crossed, watching the screen as if he had already seen the ending of the movie. "There!" Daniel said, pointing to a flickering line of hex code on the secondary monitor. Marcus zoomed in on the timestamp. He counted the cycles. His face, which had been red with irritation, suddenly turned a sickly shade of ash gray. He stopped typing. He looked at the screen, and then at the contract guy, and then finally at Elena. He's right," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "There's a slight inconsistency. The secondary actuator is responding 0.38 milliseconds after the command. The software's smoothing algorithm was filtering it out as environmental noise, but it's consistent. It's a rhythmic lag." The room went cold. The green lights on the primary display were still glowing brightly, mocking them with their false confidence. The computer was still reporting that everything was perfect, while the raw reality was reporting a disaster in the making. Elena walked over to the terminal, her eyes fixed on the flickering red line. "What happens if we hit Mach 08 with that lag?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel stepped forward, his voice now devoid of any defensive edge. It was the voice of a master pilot briefing a crew. "At that speed, the air pressure on the elevator is measured in tons. The lag will cause the system to overcorrect. The overcorrection will create a nose-up pitch that the computer will try to counter. Within 10 seconds, you'll hit a structural resonance. The plane will buck like a horse. The pilots will try to override, but the manual cable tension is linked to the same actuator. You'll lose the tail, Elena. You'd lose everything." Elena felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. She looked at the two pilots who were currently sitting in the cockpit, blissfully unaware that their miracle was a trap. She thought about the "fly it or get fired" ultimatum she had just delivered. She felt a burning, genuine shame that made it hard to breathe. She realized that she had been so focused on the IPO and the board that she had been willing to ignore a man who actually knew how to listen to the wind. "We paused the flight," Elena commanded. Her voice wasn't a bark this time. It was a heavy, somber realization. The engineers exhaled, a collective, ragged sound of relief. One of the technicians actually sat down on the floor, his hands shaking. They had been 60 seconds away from authorizing a taxi to the runway. They had been 1 minute away from a national headline. One of the senior directors, a man who had been the loudest in mocking Daniel earlier, looked at his tablet and then at Daniel. "How did you find it? We've been living in this code for months. You've been on the project for 3 days. Daniel gave a small, humble shrug. "Because I wasn't looking at the code." I was listening to the aircraft. I've seen this ghost before. 10 years ago, on a prototype called the Sky Shield. We lost the airframe because we trusted the dashboard instead of the vibration. I spent 6 months in a crash investigation room looking at the same red line you're looking at now. You learn to recognize the handwriting of a disaster once you've seen it sign. Elena turned back to Daniel. The Ice Queen was gone. In her place was a woman who had just realized she was standing in the presence of a master. She didn't offer a corporate handshake. She simply bowed her head slightly. "I made a mistake," Elena said, her voice clear and resonant for everyone in the hangar to hear. "I was leading by the numbers, and I was blind to the ground." "Daniel, you didn't just save a project today. You saved 2 of my best men, and you saved me from myself." She turned to her team. "Clear the hangar. I want a full physical audit of every actuator in that tail assembly, and I don't want to hear about nominal ranges ever again. From now on, we follow the Brooks standard. If Daniel says it stays on the ground, it stays on the ground." The hardest decision in life isn't the one where you move fast. It's the one where you have the courage to stop. Stopping is an admission that the plan was flawed. It is an act of extreme humility. Most leaders fail because they are too afraid to look slow. But real power is found in the stillness of a man who knows that a $100 million failure is much slower than a one-day delay. The frantic energy of the morning had been replaced by a heavy, quiet order. The hangar doors remained closed, blocking out the Arizona heat. Daniel and a team of 5 specialists spent the next 4 hours in the bowels of the tail assembly. They didn't use tablets or software. They used fiber optic cameras and manual pressure gauges. They found the error at 1:30 p.m. It wasn't a glitch in the code. It was a physical misalignment in a secondary hydraulic bypass valve, a part that had been marked as pre-calibrated by the supplier. Because of a microscopic burr on the metal casing, the valve was sticking for a fraction of a heartbeat under high thermal loads. It was a flaw that would never show up on a static test, and it was a flaw that the diagnostic software was programmed to average out. The lead engineer, Marcus, held the faulty part in his hand. He looked at the tiny, almost invisible scratch on the metal. "We would have missed this," Marcus muttered, his face pale. "The computer told us it was a software sync issue. We would have spent weeks rewriting the kernel while the physical bomb was still ticking in the tail." The realization hit the room like a tidal wave of clarity. The freeze moment wasn't about the part being found. It was about the realization of their own arrogance. They had built a multi-billion-dollar company on the belief that their software was infallible. They had replaced human intuition with digital smooth data, and they had almost paid for that mistake with the lives of their colleagues. Elena Whitmore stood by the workbench, her designer coat discarded, her sleeves rolled up. She had been on the floor with them the entire time, bringing water and holding the light. She looked at Daniel, who was now methodically wiping his tools and placing them back into his worn leather bag. "You aren't a technician, Daniel," Elena said. It wasn't a question. No technician knows the thermal sync properties of a high-speed actuator like that. "Who are you, really?" Daniel stopped, his hand on the handle of his bag. He looked at the sleek jet and then at the young woman standing in front of him. He realized that the ghost persona was no longer useful. "I'm exactly what it says on the contract, Elena," Daniel replied quietly. "A maintenance specialist. But before I was a father, I was the chief systems architect for the Astra program. I wrote the original flight control logic for the prototypes your engineers are studying today." The room went deathly silent. The engineers recognized the name instantly. The Astra program was the holy grail of modern aerospace, the project that had quite literally taught the world how to fly in the digital age. "You're the Brooks?" Marcus gasped, dropping the valve on the table. "The one who designed the fly-by-wire fail-safes?" "I'm the one who realized that a fail-safe is only as good as the person willing to override it," Daniel said with a small, weary smile. "I left the program because I realized I was spending all my time looking at the sky and none of my time looking at my daughter. I chose the wrench because it's a lot quieter than the spotlight." Elena looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw the absolute unshakable integrity of a man who didn't need a title to be a giant. She felt a profound sense of respect that she had never felt for any board member or investor. She had been looking for talent in the top-tier recruiting firms, but she had found the most valuable mind in the world holding a mop and a wrench in her own hangar. In the real world, the biggest errors aren't the loud ones. They are the quiet, rhythmic inconsistencies that we choose to smooth over because they are inconvenient. We build towers of data on foundations of good enough, and then we wonder why they fall. Real success is found in the person who is brave enough to look at the raw, messy truth below the surface. The following week, the hangar at Whitmore Aero was fundamentally different. The doors were open, the Arizona breeze was cool, and the G-X was finally in the air, performing flawlessly over the desert. But on the ground, the hierarchy had been flattened. Elena Whitmore walked down to the technical bay. She wasn't wearing a silk suit today. She was in a simple shirt and jeans. She found Daniel in his usual spot, helping a junior tech calibrate a landing gear sensor. "I shouldn't have pushed like that, Daniel," Elena said, leaning against the workbench. The fly it or get fired comment. It was a failure of leadership. I was more worried about the IPO than the airframe. Daniel stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "You needed a decision, Elena. And in a building with 2,000 people, the pressure can make anyone lose their heading. You didn't fail. You just needed a different set of instruments to read the situation." Elena nodded, a genuine soft smile reaching her eyes. "And you gave me a better one. You gave me the truth." A manager walked by, stopping for a moment. "Daniel, the board is asking for the final integrity report on the G-X. Do you have time for a meeting at 4? Daniel checked his watch. "I have exactly 20 minutes. But at 4:20, I have a mission at a local elementary school involving a science project and a very demanding client named Emma." The manager didn't roll his eyes. He didn't scoff. He simply nodded and said, "We'll make it quick, sir. We wouldn't want to trigger a Brooks Protocol shutdown." Elena watched as the manager walked away. She turned to Daniel. "Why didn't you argue harder that first morning? You could have humiliated us all with your resume in 10 seconds. Daniel slung his bag over his shoulder. "Because titles don't win arguments, Elena. Physics does, and people don't really listen until the stakes matter. I wasn't there to be the architect. I was there to be a professional." As Daniel walked toward his old truck, Elena realized that the most important asset in her billion-dollar company wasn't the code or the contracts. It was the humanity of the people who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. The story of the single dad in the hangar didn't end with a headline or a merger. It ended with a simple, honest connection. Daniel Brooks was no longer a ghost. He was the anchor. And for the first time in his life, the view from the ground was just as beautiful as the view from 50,000 feet. Value isn't something you demand with a title. It's something you provide with your presence. The strongest systems are the ones built on the honesty of the ground level. Never judge a person by the uniform they wear. Judge them by the character they show when the room goes dark and the sensors fail. Real expertise is quiet, but truth is loud. Don't be afraid to stop the flight if the foundation is shaking. Listening to the right voice at the right time is the only difference between a crash and a landing. If you believe that listening can prevent bigger mistakes, subscribe for more stories like this and tell me in the comments, would you have taken off or waited? Have you ever had to stand your ground against a boss to do what was right?